So thrilled to be here. I have to say that I want to welcome you all. This is so exciting to be part of the first edition of the Jaipur Literary Festival in Boulder. I have to say that when I have this handy little GPS that speaks to me, it's not my poetic imagination. It actually speaks to me. And when I arrived here, it said, "You have arrived." And I thought, yes, I have. This is fantastic. I'm going to introduce our panel to discuss the topic of the poetic imagination. But first of all, I thought, since this is really about them and not about me, I thought I'd get my shot in now. I thought I'd recite for you my most popular poem on the internet, which says everything that I know about the poetic imagination. It's called Artichoke, and it goes like this. "O heart weighed down by so many wings." Thank you.
Fantastic.
So with that, I'll turn it over to the experts. Beginning, I'll go, this will be left to right from my point of view, right to left from yours. Eleni Sikelianos is the author of 7 books of poetry, I believe, maybe 8 by now. She's been writing like crazy, including a landmark volume entitled The California Poem, and a translation of Jacques Roubaud's Exchanges on Light. Her work appears in not 1 but 2 Norton anthologies, and she has collaborated with filmmakers, visual artists, composers, and musicians, including Philip Glass and Ed Bose. She is a professor of creative writing in the PhD program at University of Denver, and teaches as well off and on at Marotta University here in Boulder. Next to her is Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. In addition to 4 collections of his own poetry, he is the editor of the Oxford India Anthology of 12 Modern Indian Poets and the collected poems in English of Arun Kolatkar. He is also the translator of The Absent Traveler, Prakrit, Love Poetry, and most recently, The Songs of Kabir, which I can personally recommend for its freshness and verve. It's an amazing translation of Kabir. He is a professor of English at the University of Allahabad in the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. I just wanted to say that, Uttar Pradesh. It's such a if you know. I'm trying to think, now the man's name has gone out of my head. The novelist, Evan S. Connell, has a wonderful story called Lost in Uttar Pradesh. So that's just a reading recommendation. And then on the end here, Vijay Seshadri comes to us today from Bangalore, India, by way of Columbus, Ohio, and Brooklyn, where he is currently the Myers Professor of Writing at Sarah Lawrence College. Mr. Seshadri's most recent book, 3 sections, earned him the Pulitzer Prize last year. And I believe he is the only poet to have a poem appear on the back of The New Yorker. There may be others, but I don't think so. Anyway, this poem I just discovered was written in response to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but was accepted by The New Yorker and printed on the back of The New Yorker after 9/11. And it's amazing how a poem written long before that event speaks to that event. And maybe that says something about the poetic imagination right there. So I think what I'll do is turn it over to Arvind to begin with, because he, as a translator, he is bringing over these wonderful poets, and so he has to be familiar with the poetic imagination across these boundaries. Arvind.
I'm going to, am I audible? Is it? What I'll do is I have a 2-page double-spaced statement on the poetic imagination. It'll take me exactly 6 minutes or less to read. And it's and most of it is poetry, and which I'll link with bits of prose, what I understand by the poetic imagination. The poetic imagination works in mysterious ways, but never more so than when it is being unpoetic. Other than what people believe, a poet is not a dreamer with his head perpetually in the clouds, as the caricature has it. On the contrary, he is someone who walks the firm earth, especially those parts of it that are less than beautiful. A BBC talk show is called Heart Talk, which is exactly what poets do. Easy friend, what's the big fuss about? Once dead, the body that was stuffed with kilos of sweets is carried out to be burnt, and the head on which a bright turban was tied is rolled by crows in the dust. A man with a stick will poke the cold ashes for your bones. But I'm wasting my time, says Kabir. Even death's bludgeon about to crush your head won't wake you up. That was the medieval Hindi poet Kabir, telling it straight, but also aware that despite the hard talk, no one is really listening to him. Now, for our generation of poets, Kabir, of course, is 15th century, but someone who, for our generation of poets, redefined the poetic imagination was Arun Kolatkar. Kolatkar, incidentally, many years ago came to the Naropa Institute where he read his poems. He was a friend of Ginsberg's and Anne Waldman's, and he hung out with Ginsberg in Bombay in 1962. So that's the old sort of connection between, well, Boulder and Bombay. Now, someone who, for our generation of Indian poets, redefined the poetic imagination was Arun Kolatkar. To him, though he never said it in so many words, the poetic imagination was another phrase for the everyday magic of sight and sound. The world he presented before us had always been there, glowing in every particle, but no one before him had had the imagination to notice it. The radiance he experienced was reflected in his poems. Sitting in an Irani restaurant in Bombay, having a cup of tea, he overheard one man say to another in Bombay street Hindi, मैं मैनेजर को बोला मुझे पगार मांगता है, मैनेजर बोला कंपनी के रूल से पगार 1 तारीख को मिलेगा। उसकी घड़ी टेबल पे पड़ी थी, मैंने घड़ी उठा के लिया और मैनेजर को पुलिस चौकी का रास्ता दिखाया, बोला अगर कंप्लेंट करना है तो कर लो, मेरे रूल से पगार आज ही होगा। Now, Kolatkar turned Bombay Pathwa into American English, and it goes like this. I want my pay, I said to the manager. You'll get paid, said the manager, but not before the first. Don't you know the rules? Coolly, I picked up his wristwatch that lay on his table. Want to bring in the cops, I said. According to my rules, listen, baby, I get paid when I say so. So this is 60s Kolatkar, translating Bombay Pathwa, Bombay street Hindi, into the American idiom. Of course, he had never visited America in the 1960s. He only came to America in the 1980s, when he was in his mid-40s. But what I'm trying to get at is that Indian poets, when they spoke of the poetic imagination, it was the American idiom that opened that imagination. And that's another story which we may have to tell another time. The human ear is one component of the poetic imagination. Another is the human eye. One of the poems in Jejuri, which is Kolatkar's long poem, now available in an NYRB classic. One of the poems in Jejuri, the eponymous temple town in western Maharashtra, is a low temple. Here is Kolatkar paying it a visit. Now, Kolatkar goes to Jejuri, this town near Pune in western Maharashtra, and he goes to the temple. And this is what happens when he goes to the temple. There is a reference to a charminar, which is a cigarette, a brand of cigarette. A low temple keeps its gods in the dark. You lend a matchbox to the priest. One by one, the gods come to light. Who was that, you ask? The 8-armed goddess, the priest replies. A skeptic match coughs. You can count. But she has 18, you protest. All the same, she is still an 8-armed goddess to the priest. You come out in the sun and light a charminar. Children play on the back of a 20-foot tortoise. The poetic imagination is a clear-eyed, clear-headed instrument. It is not easily fooled. Perhaps that is why poets have been called seers. They can cut through the crap, especially priestly crap. If they have divine insight, it is that the mundane, a goddess with a mere 18 arms, is all we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. I especially love that idea of the human ear and the human eye being brought together. And that actually provides a segue. This was not planned, to Eleni, who is, I think, going to be discussing that concept.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yeah, and so much to talk about in terms of translation, bringing new possibilities across languages back and forth in poetry. I'm also going to read a short poetic statement. I didn't time it, but I'm going to say it also takes 6 minutes. And I actually did some quick, goofy sketches to illustrate some of the points. Oh, did I bring? Oh, I forgot my. Let's see. I need this handy-dandy pointer, I guess, to change them. And let's see. We don't need them yet, in just a minute. So I wanted to talk about the line break because I was thinking about, it's such a broad topic, the poetic imagination. There's so many places we could go. And I was thinking about the way, for me, much of the poetic imagination resides in the line break, that leap that happens. And I'm just going to set aside, I'm not going to pretend that Baudelaire didn't exist, but I'm going to set aside the invention and perpetuation of the prose poem for a moment. So, a car is driving down a dark road. Suddenly, it must quickly turn the corner, and the driver, writer, reader doesn't quite know what's after the curve. That is, whoops, this is sort of floppy, but is the sound okay back there? Yeah, okay. That is what Lucretius called the clinamen, the swerving of matter that animates all matter. For example, atoms, DNA, and the poem. The line break provides the mystery novel portion of the poem, that tension between sound, meaning, and interruption that is almost all of what a poem is to me. And we could just put that, is the image up yet? Could you go ahead and put the image up? A piece of mylar wrap being pulled at opposite edges. On one end is the poem itself, the whole. The other is its line breaks. It crinkles and shimmers from the pressure between these two. It makes a kind of pleasing, disruptive noise. If it's saran wrap, the whole thing gets slightly, permanently deformed, and that carries a certain pleasure too. Oh, I see, it's up over there. Oh, can you go back? You guys are actually, yeah, okay, there we go. Thank you. And I was thinking of so when the line breaks, it's sort of, we can think of language as a kind of heartbeat. We hear that very much in, say, Blake's Tiger poem, where you hear the beat of the heart in the beat of the language, and then at the end of the line, suddenly the heart stops, everything stops, and then it comes back again when you get back to the line. I have seen the line as a kind of suspension system, something like the Brooklyn Bridge with pylons at either end. The cable line conducts energy, but the line break, in its pressuring effect, electrifies it. Sorry, you guys, I guess you can see down there. These are, sorry, my very unprofessional sketches. I wanted to talk about how the line break, like the articulations in a spider's leg, is what allows movement, the impossible and necessary movement between, say, time, marked by language, and timelessness, pure open space. And I just very randomly picked one of my favorite poets this morning because I thought almost any poem could illustrate this. So here you have the time of language, and then suddenly, to the right in English, you have the timelessness of pure open space. You could also say it's maybe an articulation between self, as articulated in language, and not self in that pure open space. between human technology, language, what Cage and others have called the militarization of mind in language, and then the not human, the open space on the right. Between human imagination, language, and universal imagination, space. And maybe we should just quickly read this poem by the great Wisconsin poet Lori Niedecker, who was really one of the, she was a 20th century poet, died in 1970, one of the sort of first eco-poets that we can talk about. And I don't know if you all know what the wild pigeon refers to. That's the passenger pigeon that went extinct in, was it 1911, Jack Cullum? Yes. Yes, Jack Cullum also has a... 1914, when Martha, the last, she was what we call an endling, the very last of her kind, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. And so this is the bird, the species that Lori Niedecker is referring to in this wild pigeon. And it goes, did not man, maimed by no stonefall, mash the cobalt and carnelian of that bird? Which is so amazing, just how in that white open space of the poetic imagination the bird can take flight without human language to trap it. The line break shows us the edges at which the human imagination can lap, the places it can push and recede, how it touches the world we think we know and departs from it, how it expands and collapses the space between the theoretical and the real. If Keats's negative capability, which, if you don't know, is that notion that a great mind can hold two opposing things without canceling them out, that we can have a kind of both. If Keats's negative capability or Cage's Buddhism has taught us anything, it's that ideas, poems, art can inhabit a third territory where more than dichotomies are possible. The line break leaps across these various dualities, breaks them, and stitches them together at once. Poetry's function, it has been said, is to name. And we speak lovingly of that gap between the word and its thing. Yes, to name, but also to unname in that white space, and more, the action between these two, a poetry of verbing, activating the space between two worlds, which is an activation of materials, the motion, the flame that leaps word to word, line to line, is the matter, the relational. Some have declared the aporia or break between the silent biological functions of the body and the moment a self speaks forth to call that body I, insurmountable. It is in this gap, indicative also of the gap between the human and the non-human, metaphored by the leap just after the line, that the free fall of imagination occurs.
Thank you. Wow. A talk about poetry that is poetry itself. I like that. We will, in the spirit of leaping, imaginative leaping, we will leap to the end for Vijay, who may expand on that. Vijay, his poetry, in a way, instead of being like Niedecker's, which is so wonderfully taught, and his is open and flowing in a way. I'm sorry to characterize you before you even get to speak, but now it's your turn.
Yeah. I don't know. I've always thought of myself as sort of taught. Self-taught. Who did that? Yeah. Unfortunately, unlike my distinguished fellow panelists, I don't have a statement, so I'm going to be a lot more incoherent than they are. And I think I didn't come up with a statement when I could have, simply because the notion of imagination and poetic imagination are sort of fraught, and and I always tend to go back to basics and definitions and etymologies and histories when I don't understand anything, when I don't understand something, and I don't quite understand what other people mean by poetic imagination. I understand what people mean by imagination, and I feel that imagination is essential to poetry, as it is essential to all forms of other art, as it is essential to living human life. And it's essential to playing golf, for example. People would say about Tiger Woods, when Tiger Woods was still Tiger Woods, that he was very imaginative around the greens, right? Because he would read a landscape and he would respond with his shot in relationship to that landscape in such a way as to come up with unique solutions to problems, rather than solutions to problems which were received. And so I think the action of imagination is something that's so much a part of our lives that we just take it for granted. We're being imaginative all the time. So what is poetic imagination in relationship to that? And it has certain distinctions, and I would define the fundamental distinction between, or the fundamental kind of articulation of imagination as poetic imagination as this, that poetic imagination is imagination per se, disciplined by what I would call rhetoric. And I mean rhetoric in a broad way rather than in a constricted way, as rhetoric as the means of persuasion, and rhetoric as a means by which human action is made two-sided, that it's interactive, because a piece of rhetoric requires an audience of one, an audience of 100, an audience who might just be only yourself, but still is your audience. And the discipline of the imagination by means of rhetoric and the fundamental kind of vehicle of rhetoric, which is language, language is the receptacle of rhetoric, is sort of what I think of as the poetic imagination. And then subsequent to that, and I think, we might be able to talk about this later, there has been a kind of growing romanticization of what imagination is and what poetry is. If you kind of go back historically to Aristotle, for example. Aristotle says poetry is a lot of things in the Poetics. One of the central things he says it is the making of metaphor. And he also says in the rhetoric that the making of metaphor can't be taught. It seems to be something that pre-exists in our consciousness. And I think that was a pretty straightforward idea of what poetic activity was for a long, long time. And it's only when you get to the Romantic period that the imagination sort of overflows its boundaries and becomes this faculty that not only is operative in the sense that it yokes together seemingly disparate elements in an imaginative act that unifies them, right? But somehow becomes this force that is constitutive of the world, And in the great Romantic poems, you just see that over and over and over again, like the poem I mentioned in my reading yesterday, Intimations of Immortality. I mean, the mind and its primary faculty, the imagination, is constructing the world. It's not merely construing or organizing the world in certain ways. It is actually the constructive spiritual force of the world. Which goes back to earlier sort of notions of what, say, genius is, right? Like in the old days, people thought that genius was something that lived inside of everyone. It was actually sort of a divine little spirit that, operated in you and turned your mind on and off when it chose. And that gets transmuted in the modern idea of the imagination. And You know, and I think it's not merely speculative on our parts as poets to think about what this is, because I think as practicing writers and as people who live in the world and have to use our imagination to understand what's happening in front of us, you know, to see the invisible behind the visible, you know. I mean, you kind of have to use your imagination to understand the motivations of others, for example, you know, because all you have is their behavior. And so in a way that is very, very important for all of us, we sort of have to understand what it is, what it means when we're talking about imagination. And, you know, and I tend, when I come across concepts like the poetic imagination, to feel a certain reluctance, you know, because I think there's so many implications, you know, in that word and its adjective, that we sort of have to step back and unpack what we actually mean. And what we usually mean is a sort of romantic idea of what the poetic imagination is, which I think a lot of us have been dissatisfied with for hundreds of years, but we've never really been able to get out of. And I will, you know, I'm going to read a poem. I'm going to kind of get poetic here, but it's not my poem. It's a poem by Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentinian writer, who was also, you know, we know him for his stories. He was also a wonderful poet. But his poetry is interesting in relationship to his stories, because the stories are things we think of as hyper-modern texts, you know, filled with a kind of meta-narrative. And his poems are very straightforward late 19th century romantic poems, you know. They could have been written by Cristina Rossetti, you know. It's that kind of a poet that he was. But they're really quite beautiful poems, and this is one in which he really lays out what has been the romantic idea of what poetry is and what the poetic imagination is. And it's called, you know, appropriately, Ars Poetica. To look at the river made of time and water, and remember that time is another river. To know that we are lost like the river, and that faces dissolve like water. To be aware that waking dreams it is not asleep, while it is another dream, and that the death that our flesh goes in fear of is that death which comes every night and is called sleep. To see in the day or in the year a symbol of the days of man and of his years. To transmute the outrage of the years into a music, a murmur of voices, and a symbol. To see in death sleep, and in the sunset a sad gold. Such is poetry, which is immortal and poor. Poetry returns like the dawn and the sunset. At times in the evenings a face looks at us out of the depths of a mirror. Art should be like that mirror, which reveals to us our own face. They say that Ulysses, sated with marvels, wept tears of love at the sight of his Ithaca, green and humble. Art is that Ithaca of green eternity, not of marvels. It is also like the river with no end, that flows and remains and is the mirror of the one same inconstant Heraclitus, who is the same and is another, like the river with no end. It's a beautiful poem, all right? You know. The interesting thing about the poem, if you deconstruct it, is that both ideas of the imagination are working in it. You know, there's an idea of the imagination that's fairly strictly Aristotelian, that the imagination is, you know, drawing together unlike things by discerning in unlike things a likeness of some sort. And it is kind of making invisible elements visible. You know, it is making the ordinary strange and the strange ordinary. You know, it is seeing in, you know, but as Borges explores this idea of what poetry is and what the poetic imagination is, he gets deeper and deeper and deeper into it. So the poetic imagination becomes, by the end of the poem, visionary and constitutive of the world. It is actually making the world. It is taking, you know, at the end it says, you know, they say that Ulysses, sated with marvels, wept tears of love at the sight of his Ithaca, green and humble. Art is that Ithaca of green eternity and not of marvels. So Borges is saying there, well, you know, this quotidian life, you know, we are constituting its mystery by the act of poetry, and we are making mysterious and, or restoring, he would say, in a sort of Platonic way, the actual mystery that is there, that we don't see. And so that what imagination does is it strips away the veils. So we see the strangeness in the ordinary and stuff like that. So there are these two ideas of, you know, there's an Aristotelian idea of the imagination, there's a Platonic idea of the imagination, and they're operating in relationship to each other in this poem, and they're kind of confused with each other. And I guess I'll close just by saying that, you know, what I would say when we talk about imagination is we are expressing a great confusion about what it actually is, which we haven't quite resolved, I don't think, you know, I mean, and I think we perpetuate it when we keep going on and talking about it. But I think it's important, I think, for us to sit there and say, well, what is it that we're doing when we're making meaning, you know, because that's the activity of our lives, really. You know, whether we're poets or not, you know, we're in the business of making things meaningful, and the thing that is making things meaningful for us is our imagination, you know. You might be driving your car down the street and thinking of yourself as, you know, I don't know, Don Giovanni or something like that, and, you know, huh? Yeah, right. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have. Okay, thank you.
I'm glad you brought up the quotidian, because my handler is over here waving a sign. We only have a few minutes left. We got a late start, but we're the ones that have to get shaved. You know how that goes. But we may have time for a question. Who has a question for anyone on the panel or the entire panel? Yes. Yeah.
There we go. That was wonderful, a very enjoyable way to start the day. I had a question that arose while Vijay was speaking, because you traced sort of history of ideas about imagination from Aristotle to the Romantics, and then you mentioned supermodern. But then I thought, what about different ideas that don't have this European genealogy? Arvind is nodding his head, right? So that, I don't know, you have to represent all of India right there on the stage. So I just wondered about different ideas about imagination that come from India or elsewhere. Anybody in the audience can talk to me throughout the weekend about that.
Yeah. I have no idea about it. I'm so sorry, but I shouldn't be treated like a representative of Indian wisdom. But it's true. I don't know, but what Indians have different ideas of the non-Aristotelian, obviously. But,
yeah. Well,
or
I mean,
Chinese, or you know, there's a whole sort of Chinese world that we know. At least I know very little about.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think, you know, answering questions like that is another, you know, like, I spend all of my life these days in avoiding intellectual traps, you know, and I feel like that is one too, because of course our concept of imagination is entirely dependent upon a secularization in our understanding of these faculties, which you can't really ascribe to, say, Indian or East Asian intellectual developments, because in India they would talk about Atman, they would talk about, you know, and those things we call imagination would be subsumed in some sort of different faculty that is closer to what the West would call the soul, right?
No, I don't think so. I think they would talk about rasa, they would talk about aesthetic categories, not just spiritual ones. But I'm talking too much.
But like what aesthetic categories?
Oh, rasa and ideas about composition. But I'm not on this panel, please excuse me.
No, you see, what Indians would talk about is dhvani more than anything else, which is suggestion, resonance. So the imagination has to also come from the reader, the reader has to make the imaginative leap into the poem. And so that is one idea, which is certainly part of the Indian tradition that I know a little bit about. But then I'm really no expert on this.
Oh, sorry, his hand was first.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, if we can just maybe pass it.
We have 1 minute, I'm being told.
Okay. Is there a difference between poetic imagination or, say, scientific imagination or imagination in a prose or something? Or for that matter, how would you define poetry as such?
1 minute.
Eleni? I think that's for you.
What was that? Define what as such?
Poetry
As such. I had a very, very brief career as a biology undergraduate major, and I find, for me, I didn't go into deep theoretical science, but I find a great similarity between the theoretical and the real, and the testing the ground between the two, but in poetry and both poetry and science. Since we have probably 20 seconds left, I'll just leave you with a William Carlos Williams quote that came to me while Vijay was speaking. It's a kind of koan. Only the imagination is real.
And let me second that with a quote from that great romantic poet Albert Einstein, who said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." Thank you.